Of introducing, I'd like to introduce Mike Ryan of the M. Ryan Group. Mike is a degreed engineer, master's in engineering. He is a GE certified Six Sigma black belt and has also lectured at the University of Akron in the past. Mike is pretty much known as a kind of a roll up the sleeves advisor. He has many years, 20 plus years of experience in operations and supply chain with manufacturers like GE and Goodyear. He is recognized for his ability to break a problem down, articulate the challenges, identify solutions and ideas, and motivate a team to help deliver on those ideas. He's built a reputation as a valued partner for businesses needing to free up cash and improve their working capital while delivering on operational results. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Ryan.
Well, good morning, Ron, and thank you for the introduction. I truly appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to present on behalf of Manufacturing Works to the membership. I, too, am a member of Manufacturing Works, and I found it's one of the best organizations in Northeast Ohio to help connect manufacturers to one another. So without further ado, we will jump right in. Today, we are going to be talking about how to crush the inventory iceberg. And it's navigating manufacturing and supply chain challenges in a post-COVID world. Along the way, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them. Following the presentation, the materials will be available, as well as an Excel workbook that has been put together. The idea behind this session is to truly make it actionable. So instead of me just simply pontificating for the next 40 minutes or so, it's about taking something and doing something with it, becoming actionable. All right, so this is me. As Ron said, my background is 20 years of corporate supply chain and operations, and the last 4 years or so, I've been leading my own firm in helping recognize the opportunity for manufacturers to unlock cash and harvest it off the balance sheet. So this is designed to elicit a chuckle. And the idea is that most often inventory is directly proportional to cash flow. So when inventory goes through the roof, cash flow typically falls to the floor. And it's when a business starts to feel pain that the light goes off and says, hey, I think we need to take a look at our people, process, and technology and see how it ties into inventory. So today we'll talk about how cash is king, pre and post-COVID supply chain, warning signs to look out for with your inventory. We'll step-by-step 4 actions that you can take today to discover how much cash you have frozen in inventory. We'll talk about some opportunities and challenges, and then open it up at the end for a question and answer. So the visual you see on your screen, the iceberg with the $100 bills embedded in it, the idea is that 10% that's above the water, those are the inventory that we see and we feel. And then below the waterline, that's the combination of people, process, and technology that determine how big or how small that iceberg is. So we've all heard the idea that cash is king. And over the last several months, it's become readily apparent. And the one thing I've learned is that while cash is king, and therefore inventory is cash, it does not mean that inventory is king. Cash is still king. Cash that you can take and go to the store and buy in a gallon of milk with, that's king. Last time I checked, Giant Eagle or Acme will not accept cardboard boxes as cash, so inventory is not king. It's about being a balancing act in a business. It's balancing customer satisfaction versus cash flow. And inventory is designed to help protect against supply chain interruptions. And we've seen some of those firsthand over the last few months. The idea is that inventory is a shock absorber. It's a spring. And each component of inventory, whether we're talking raw materials, work in process, or finished goods, each type of inventory serves a different purpose in a business. So raw material, it's designed to protect against supply shortages. So making sure you have enough material to process and you don't run out before your next delivery comes. Work in process, there are few manufacturing businesses where each step in the process takes exactly the same amount of time. And having a work in process inventory helps buffer, helps smooth that ebb and flow. And then finished goods inventory, that's to protect the business against changes in customer demand. So having the right product at the right time is a wonderful way to keep your customers happy. And the idea with inventory, the goal is the idea of Goldilocks. We don't want too little, we don't want too much. We want our inventory to be just right. That's how we optimize our cash. So as we reflect on the last 3 months or so, I've heard more about the supply chain in the last 10 weeks than I have in the last 20 years. And the idea is that some of the things where our supply chain has evolved to become more efficient and flow better over time, we saw some disruptions across the supply chain. So the idea of just-in-time manufacturing is, okay, whether it's Walmart or Target or a grocery store, they have enough material to cover for the expected lead time. So if the lead time increases, stores can be caught short. So you go to the store shelf, there's nothing there because demand has spiked. So demand has spiked, just-in-time inventory gets wiped out, and then it takes time to replenish. So changes in demand can be very disruptive to just-in-time manufacturing. I also saw firsthand with several clients the challenge and risk around being sole sourced. So there may be a vendor, whether they're local or offshore, that has been predictable and stable for the last 10 years. With this disruption, there was a tremendous risk in being sole source. So that was kind of an eye opener around being able to minimize cost by going to one source inherently creates risk. And the supply chain as a whole was designed with stability in mind. Right? It's about being predictable. So even when there's seasonal customer demand, it's being prepared for that. And the last 3 months have shown us that when things get unstable around the supply chain, the stability suffers. So as we look forward, the idea is to take what we've learned and what we've seen and shift from reactive to proactive. And the 4 ways a business can do that is understanding what their current demand is, talking with their customers, refining the idea of balancing demand and supply. So once you understand what your customers need, do you have the supply that will meet that demand? It's far better to figure out today that you're going to be short 30 days from now than 29 days from now, figure out that you've got a lot of customers to call. One of the things that has come to the forefront, and it's an opportunity that I recognize and Manufacturing Works is taking the lead on, is it's an opportunity to evaluate reshoring. The idea that, hey, let's ship it to China, it's going to be cheaper, quite frankly, that's just lazy thinking. In that maybe 15 years ago, it was a no-brainer. But now understanding the length of the supply chain, how much cash could be tied up on the water, the risk of having 12 to 16 week lead times, the idea that it can't be made at the same cost here in the United States is an idea that needs challenged, because there are plenty of manufacturers who would welcome the opportunity to be a domestic supplier for a domestic manufacturer. And as we go through and just reiterate, cash is king, one of the big shifts has been businesses digging into that balance sheet to find places where there's cash. So when we look at the warning signs for inventory, the idea here is to provide kind of a full 360-degree view, both externally and internally. One of the easiest and first indicators that a business doesn't have the right inventory is a CEO or the VP of sales starts to get calls from angry customers. It could be that the back orders are climbing or the delivery lead times are getting longer. These are all warning signs that there could be a problem with inventory. Internally, it's the CFOs recognizing that a business is running out of cash. Now, this may not be visible to the organization as a whole, but within the finance organization, it's seeing a growing iceberg of working capital. So the amount of cash that's tied up going up and up and up. It could be the business doesn't have enough cash to buy raw materials, right? So that's really when a business can run into a problem where they don't have the cash to buy the materials that they need. So they get stuck in this trap of they can't buy what they need, so they can't produce and they can't sell to get more cash in. And the other thing that I've seen is businesses then having to go to the bank to tap into their line of credit. And depending on what the inventory position is, the bank may say, hey, you're overutilized on your line of credit. We can't give you any more money. You need to look inside your business and figure out where that cash is. From a physical perspective, it could be you're literally running out of room. Boxes and pallets packed to the ceiling, sitting in the aisles. And one of the things that I am always on the lookout for and listening for is when a business says, hey, we need to rent another warehouse. Whenever I hear that, I say, whoa, time out. Let's make sure you have the inventory you need before you go rent more space. Because what I found personally, professionally, is that the more warehouse space there is, it's just like having more closets at home. The more closets you have at home, the more stuff you're going to stick in them. Same thing goes for warehouse. And at a very high level, it's a big warning sign that inventory is out of balance is simply the business is not running smoothly. The business is not meeting their financial goals. So that could be cash flow, working capital, customer service. All those metrics can and do tie back to inventory. So before I go any further, one of the things that I really want to take a minute to highlight is the idea of process. Process is built into my DNA, and anything can be seen as a process. So whether it is brushing your teeth or boiling water for spaghetti, it's all a process. And when I hear people say, oh, we've got a process, the three questions I ask are, is it definable, predictable, and repeatable? Definable means you can literally draw a picture of the process. So from order to cash, from demand to fulfillment, you can draw a picture of the steps that a product or service go through. Predictable means you can describe the results. You can tell me what is going to happen. So for a process to be predictable, I can tell you what happens at step A, B, C, D, E, and what the finished output is going to be. And repeatable, that's the same thing happens every single time. So if you flip a light switch and the light comes on one time and you flip it again and the air conditioning kicks on the next time, right? It's not repeatable. If you have a product that's, purple and then red and then green and then yellow, that's not repeatable. So to truly have a process, it needs to be definable, predictable, and repeatable. When it comes to systems, I personally work with manufacturers and distributors of all shapes and sizes. And one thing I've learned is whatever they have, whether it's Excel spreadsheets, QuickBooks, JD Edwards, SAP, the data is there and any system will work. So one thing I want to be crystal clear about, it doesn't matter if you're a $5 million business or a $500 million business or a $5 billion business, whatever system you have is fine, right? There's plenty to work with. And then with regards to some of the data that we're going to be talking about as we get to the actionable portion, an individual may not have access to the balance sheet. They may not have access to the income statement. So the idea as we walk through this will be to give you the reason why to go ask the CFO or the controller, hey, I'm trying to figure out inventory turns. Can you share average inventory by month and cost of goods sold? And I found that 99 times out of 100, if you ask for data, you will get the data, provided that you put it in context. So just to put a bow on the point, all types and sizes of business, whether you're a manufacturer or a distributor or a retailer, if you have inventory and you have any type of system, you can get the data to take these actionable steps that we will be discussing. All right, so what we are going to walk through and discuss are inventory as a percent of assets. So that's figuring out how much of your assets are frozen in inventory. The second one is going to be walking through the calculation for inventory turns, which is an understanding of how often you convert your product, your inventory into cash. The value of one turn. So this is the WIFM, the what's in it for me. So as you're making a case to drive improvements in your business, it's being able to say, hey, if we go from 3 turns to 4 turns, it's worth $1.3 million. To me, that's usually the eye opener where people sit up and take notice to say, hey, you can harvest $1 million in cash off the balance sheet. Sign me up. Tell me what I need to do. And then the last one is inventory splits. So this is a way to quickly look and see where your inventory dollars are sitting to give you a sense of where the opportunity can be. So in other words, what area to target first. All right, so the first one, inventory as a percent of assets, that shows the portion of assets that are tied up. This is a measure of financial efficiency. So it's saying how much of your cash or how much of your assets are usable and how much of your assets are otherwise tied up. In general, the lower number, the lower inventory is as a percent of total assets, the better. And inventory as a percent of assets can also influence lending decisions. So if a business is over-indexed with the amount of inventory they are carrying, a bank may say, hey, we can only lend up to 50% of the borrowing base. So if your borrowing base is too big, while they may give you the loan, it's going to come at a higher cost. To figure out inventory as a percent of assets, there's 2 data points. One is inventory dollars, and that's found on the balance sheet. And then 2 is total assets, which is also found on the balance sheet. And inventory as a percent of assets is typically done on a point basis. So whether it's month end or quarter end or year end, that's where that point of comparison is made. And the equation for this is very straightforward. Total inventories divided by total assets. And from working with several clients, from looking at Dun & Bradstreet industry benchmarks, what I found is that if inventory as a percent of assets is greater than 40%, it could be a red flag. It could be a sign of a problem. I had sat down in the fall with a prospective client and I said, hey, if you share your financials with me just on the tabletop, I can do some quick math and figure out what your inventory as a percent of assets are. And I went into the meeting prepared, had a Dun and Bradstreet benchmark for their business industry and their size. The benchmark was 31%. So, in a sample of something like 12,000 businesses, the average was 31% inventory as a percent of assets. And as I'm going through, I know I made a face. As I was going through the total inventories, total assets, I know I made a face. And the guy looks at me and says, "What's our number?" I said, "Your number is 84%. And he looks at me and he says, "Is that a problem?" And I said, "Well, let's just say that there's a tremendous opportunity to harvest some cash from inventory that you can use to pay down some of your debt." So inventory as a percent of assets is a really good high-level indicator of the financial efficiency of a business. So when we come to inventory turns, this is something that I find fascinating because it's a term that a lot of people talk about, but may not be willing to share that they understand what goes into the calculation. So part of the conversation today is to step you through, hey, how do I calculate inventory turns? So inventory turns ultimately is an indicator of cash flow. The higher the turns, the faster your cash flow. So if your business inventory has 2 turns, that means your inventory, your cash, sits for 12 months divided by 2. So your inventory is tied up in cash 6 months at a time. It takes 6 months to turn that cash over. If you had 4 turns, right, you turn your cash over every 3 months. So the higher the number, the faster the cash flow. To do the math for inventory requires cost of goods sold. That comes from the income statement. So that's also COGS, cost of goods sold, and the average inventory from the balance sheet. This is typically done on a rolling 12-month basis. So whether it's July of last year to June this year, January to December, 12 months are used to help smooth out any variations, whether it's driven by seasonality or spikes in customer demand. So when I talk about inventory turns, it's on a rolling 12-month basis. And the formula, the math behind it is cost of goods sold. So that's everything that went into materials and labor and everything that goes into the equation. And then the average inventory. So that is the inventory at month's end on average across the 12 months. And again, that's done to reduce variation. So here's a word of caution. If sales are used in place of COGS, it will artificially inflate inventory turns. So let's say your cost of goods sold is 15 million and your sales is 30 million. Sales bakes in margin, it's the profit. So if you use sales instead of cost of goods sold, it's going to make the turns look, it could be literally twice as good as they are. So when you're calculating turns, I know quick math could be sales divided by average inventory. It's not an accurate reflection. You need to use cost of goods sold divided by average inventory. So one of the best ways that I found to help people see opportunities and identify how much cash is actually tied up in the inventory iceberg is to calculate the value of 1 turn. So if we went from 3 to 4, what's it worth to the business? If we went from 5 to 6, what's it worth for the business? So to do this, what we're going to do is flip the equation. So we'll start as normal with COGS on top of inventory. For this example, 20.52 million in cost of goods sold divided by 5.97 million in average inventory equals 3.44 turns. So what we do is we flip the equation. So turns goes to the denominator. So you've got COGS is the numerator, turns is the denominator, average inventory becomes the result. Then, in this example, if we increase turns by 1, so we go from 3.44 to 4.44 turns, the new average inventory is $4.62 million. So by going 1 turn, increasing by 1 turn in this example, going from 3.44 to 4.44 is worth $1.35 million. Now, results will vary depending on the business, depending on how much COGS and what the average inventory is. The idea behind it is to say, hey, what's in it for me? What's it worth to the business? If we were to improve the processes that surround inventory, whether it's sales and operation planning or increased collaboration between sales and manufacturing, what's it worth? What's the colloquial question is the juice worth the squeeze? So in this case, for a business to have the opportunity to free up just over $1 million, I'd say yes, it's worth investing some time and some effort in. Often I get the question, okay, where do I start? I calculated inventory turns. I figured out inventory as a percent of assets. My inventory as a percent of assets is a little bit high. My turns is a little bit low. Tell me where I should begin. With that, one of the ways I approach it, and one of the ways everybody on the presentation can approach it as well, is to come up with what I call inventory splits. So it's a visual indication of where the inventory is heavy. And depending on where that tall tent pole is, whether it's raw, work in process, or finished goods, can signal different types of opportunities. So if raw materials is disproportionately high, it could be an opportunity with procurement. There may be a buyer who's purchasing 6 months of a raw material at a time because they got a 2% discount. And one of my favorite examples is the buyer running down the hall with a purchase order that says, hey, I just saved 2% by buying 6 months of this raw material. And the CFO looking down the hall and saying, well, our cost of capital is 8%. So you actually just cost the business money. So by tying up 6 months worth of cash, it drove that raw materials balance through the roof. So raw materials heavy, it could be a procurement opportunity. If it's a work in process, if that category is the tall tent pole, it could be an issue with throughput, where work is literally piling up on the manufacturing floor and multiple batches are started, but nothing is actually getting finished. So what's interesting to me is that when someone says, hey, we've got a work in process inventory problem, it's actually an operations problem that's masquerading as an inventory problem. And in the cases where the business has the tall tent pole, the highest balance in finished goods, this is where it can get very, very interesting quickly, in that it could be manufacturing's running for absorption. So they're trying to make as many parts as quickly as possible to minimize that per unit cost. So if costs are fixed and a business makes 100 units versus 10 units, that cost gets spread out over more units. The challenge is, by packing the pantry, by putting finished goods on the shelf just for the sake of production, it quickly can tie up cash. The other potential that I've seen often is what I would call a sales forecasting opportunity. And what that means is there's salespeople who are overly optimistic. I can sell 10,000 of those. And manufacturing goes and they make as requested. They make those 10,000 pieces, and sales only sells 2,000. Right? Then the business is stuck with what at that point the business is stuck with inventory. And the irony is then it goes back onto sales to figure out in what ways it can be sold. So to do the math, it's inventory category. So whether that's raw, WIP, or finished goods divided by the total inventory. That gives a percent of the total. So if we were to look at the top example where it's raw materials heavy, 60% in raw, 22% in WIP, 18% in finished goods. So this equation will figure it out for each of the categories. And then what the calculation requires from the balance sheet is raw materials, work in process, and finished goods inventory balances. And this is typically done on a spot basis. So if May is the most recent month where the books are closed, I would say use May month end, add up to 3, divide by each one, and that will give you an idea of where your inventory is. I mean, the idea is that we want to begin with the end in mind. So as we start down the path, going from a blanket statement of we need to reduce inventory by 20%, that's all well and fine, but it doesn't give anybody an idea of where to actually start. So by running the inventory splits, it gives an indicator of what pile, whether it's raw or WIP or finished goods, to start with. So before we go into benchmarking, I just want to take a second to share a workbook. So I've put a workbook together that will let people calculate what their inventory as a percent of assets are, inventory turns, the value of 1 turn, and inventory splits. So that'll be made available after the presentation. And the idea is for people to be able to take this worksheet, go back to their desk, and do something today to get an indication of in what areas you can go work on. Okay, so we go through this process, we figure out what inventory as a percent of assets are, what our inventory turns are, how much a turn is worth, where the splits are. Okay, so what do we do with that? By benchmarking, it's identifying opportunities for improvement. So as you go through and you get a measurement, whether it's for the month of May or rolling 12 months, that's your starting point. So you can say, okay, today through the month of May 2020, here's inventory as a percent of assets, here's our turns, here's what a turn is worth, and here's the split. So it gives you a starting point, and it gives you an opportunity and a way to highlight gaps in performance. And as you look at these benchmarks, you can look at it from a year-over-year perspective. So how are my inventory turns in May of 2020 compared to May of 19? Are they getting better? Or are they getting worse? What's tied up? And then another way to benchmark is plan versus actual. So here's what we said we're going to do. Here's what we actually did, and whether you beat the plan or fell short of the plan. And then external benchmarks can come from industry publications or databases like Dun & Bradstreet Hoover's. And they provide you with an external point of reference to say, in comparison, how is your business performing? So one of the questions that came up in the chat box is, should inventory turns be done by category or product? I would say we always start at the high level. So let's do macro inventory turns for the business, understand where the business is performing. And then the interesting thing about turns is you may have something that turns 20 times a year and something that turns once a year. And on average, it may look like your turns are okay. And that's where it's peeling back the layers a little bit to look at what the logical groupings are for your business. So whether it's original equipment and aftermarket, or commercial and residential, or product line A, B, C, D, the next level down from inventory turns for the business as a whole is turns by category. So that I was working with a client last year where they had five groups of products, 5 different product categories. Benchmark for the industry average was 6.3 turns. At a high level, this business was at 3.4 turns at a high level. And breaking it down into the individual categories, we found that 3 of them were turning at 4.5 turns or more. 1 was right around that 3 turns, and 1 was doing less than 1 turn a year. So by focusing on the next level, we saw that one product category that was pulling the whole pool of the business down. So thank you for that question. Okay. So when we talk about internal and external, my recommendation is to start benchmarking internally first. Right? If the industry benchmark is 8 turns a year and you're currently at 2.3 turns a year, quite frankly, you're just going to feel bad if you compare 2.3 to 8. The idea is, hey, if we're at 2.3 now, what can we do to get to 2.8 or 3.3 or 3.5? So start internally first. Get your people, process, technology, get that all aligned, and start looking internally first. Okay. So just one more comment on benchmarking. This screenshot is from a Dun & Bradstreet database that I use with my clients. And the idea is here I can plug in any company name. It'll tie it to an NAICS code. In this case, this is manufacturers of machinery and equipment. And it gives me an idea of what the inventory as a percent of assets is for the benchmark and what the inventory turns are. So this client is in the $5 to $50 million neighborhood. So if their inventory as a percent of assets is more than 24.6%, there's probably an opportunity for improvement. And if their turns are below 4.09, there's probably an opportunity for improvement. And the nice thing that I found with benchmarking is it becomes an external source of truth. So it's not Mike's number or Ron's number or Steve's number. It's, hey, here's a data set that's got 22,363 companies in it. So it's a pretty good representation. And again, the caution here is you need to compare apples to apples. So when it comes to inventory turnover, it's COGS divided by average inventory. If you do sales divided by average inventory and try to compare it, it will look artificially good. All right, so let's see. Producing questions coming in. If I produce a product with a high value add component and my customer forces me to buy, so to pad their forecast, any techniques for negotiating with customers on payment terms or quantity? So the first thing I think about there is having a contract, whether it's a signed purchase agreement that sets expectations on quantity or timing. So if you are being put in a position where you have to buy more than you think is required for a value-added component, it's making your customer agree to say, hey, okay, manufacturer, you're going to buy 100 of these, and as the customer, we commit to taking 100 over the next 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. So it's getting it's getting some sort of buying agreement in place. The last thing a manufacturer wants to do is turn into the bank for their customers. I've worked with a number of different manufacturing businesses that say, oh, our customers require us to carry 6 months of inventory. And I'd say you've become the de facto bank for your customer. What's your lead time? Well, our lead time is 21 days. Well, then you don't need to carry 6 months worth of inventory, at least not without having something in place to minimize the risk of that customer walking away and taking their business elsewhere. Okay, so to recap, the four indicators that we discussed today are inventory as a percent of assets. Rule of thumb, you want it under 30%. If it's over 40%, probably a red flag or an opportunity that there's more cash tied up there than it needs to be. Inventory turns. So looking at your internal performance first to say, what's my turns now versus a year ago? Is it getting better or getting worse? And then looking outside the four walls to say, here's how I compare. Value of one turn. This, first and foremost, if you walk away with anything from this webinar today, it's figure out what one turn is worth to your business. If I walked up to a client and said, hey, I can save you $1.35 million, they'd say, sign me up. Here's how to do it. And then as a starting point, it's looking at the inventory splits and figuring out, okay, our turns at a high level may not be great, or even if it's within a category that they may not be great, let's look at the raw, WIP, and finished goods that go into manufacturing that product. All right, to wrap it up, I have literally heard more about supply chain in the last 12 weeks than I have in the last 10 years. So it's good, right? Supply chain is getting plenty of recognition. And it's realizing that today there's an opportunity to challenge the status quo. The supply chain has changed. And it's figuring out not how we get back to, hey, that's the way we've always done it. We want to keep doing it that way. It's learning from the bumps and the bruises and the disruptions to say, in what ways can we make this better? So asking that question, in what ways? The idea is it shouldn't be just one thing. It should be a list of things that can be done. And when it comes to any type of improvement, it's process. If it's not definable, predictable, and repeatable, it is not a process. Right? So if you don't have a process, any type of improvement that you work to create, it's not going to be repeatable. It's not going to be reproducible. So, my time and my energy should be focused first on making sure that there's a process. And once that foundation is there, that's where you can build off of that. And having that discipline around process, it truly transcends industry. So whether you're making tires today and donuts tomorrow, the principles are still the same. There's got to be a process. And one thing I've learned, and I've learned this the hard way, is as you uncover opportunities, sometimes the approach can make all the difference in the world. Using let's say a colloquial example, it's the idea of the difference between saying, hey, you know what, you look fat in those pants, right? That's like saying your baby's ugly. It's not going to go over well. So saying, hey, your inventory turns are horrible, you guys are idiots, that's not going to fly. Instead, it's, hey, you know what, you look fantastic in those other pants. Hey, you know what, if we took this approach, by doing this, we could save $1.35 million in inventory, right? That's an approach that's going to get you a high five and a pat on the back. So as you dig into the numbers and as you see the opportunity, it's understanding that first ask, that first approach, that first suggestion Um, think about how you want to approach it. All right. Following up from this webinar, there'll be an email that goes out with a link both to the presentation and the worksheet. This worksheet is available on my website. I've created a web page specifically for Manufacturing Works. It's www.mryan.com/manufacturingworks. And on that web page, I invite you to book a call. I'm happy to spend 30 minutes with anybody on the call today to identify what some of the challenges and opportunities are. There's a copy of the presentation that we reviewed this morning, as well as a copy of the Excel workbook. So you can take this in the privacy of your own office, run the numbers, and figure out in what ways you can start unlocking cash from your business. Okay, I am going to take a deep breath and a drink of water. So if anybody has any questions, I welcome the opportunity to be of service.
While you take a drink of water there, Mike, there is one question that came in that says, based on your experience, are cycle counts popular versus full inventory counts, quarterly or other methods?
Fantastic question. Cycle counts are a fantastic way to stay on top of inventory. There is nothing worse. Well, there's probably something worse, but it's pretty bad where if you go the whole year and don't do any cycle counts and you rely on your annual physical inventory to discover problems, typically those surprises are all bad. It's not, you don't want to find out on December 30th or December 31st that you've got a $529,000 write down in your inventory. That is not the time you want to figure that out. So doing regular cycle counts, especially on items where you've identified challenges in the past, doing regular cycle counts is critically important. And having the people who work with the material every day deliver those cycle counts helps reinforce the value of keeping accurate count on your inventory. So excellent question. Thank you. All right. Any other questions?
I don't see any more in the box. Ron, have you seen any?
I'm looking and I don't see any new ones right now. Give people a minute here, but Michael, I want to thank you very much for your
pleasure.
time and for sharing and to make the offer to provide a call it a toolkit or a worksheet that people can kind of enter the data, make it simple, put it in, and then take a look and maybe even compare themselves to companies within their industry, so they get a starting point from where they are. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome, Ron, and thank you, Ron, and thank you, Ann. I appreciate the opportunity. So there was an earlier question on where to get data from. So if a business wants to compare themselves to competitors in the industry, one of the things that I have access to is the Dun & Bradstreet Hoover's one-stop report. So I am happy to pull a report. They're amazingly comprehensive. Like that
Nice.
One sheet of numbers is typically 1 page out of 30. So if somebody wants to pull a benchmarking report for your industry, just send me an email, michael@mryangroup.com or info@mryangroup.com, and I'd be happy to pull a D&B benchmark.
That's terrific. Thank you. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And again, with Michael's webinar, we will be posting this, so it's available to you that participated. And we hope that we can bring more content. So if you have other ideas for us, feel free to reach out to myself or Ann. Give us other ideas you have on webinars that might resonate well with you. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a very nice afternoon. And again, thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, everybody.